Assalamualaikum and very good morning. My name is Dr. Zul Hafiz, a research officer at Academy Professor Malaysia. I am the MC for today's webinar. It is with pleasure I welcome all of you to APM Fellow Lecture Series entitled The War in Ukraine, Implication for Southeast Asia, organized by the Academy of Professors Malaysia. For your information, Academy of Professors Malaysia, or APM, is a think tank that combines expertise and mobilize the strategic thinking of professors to develop the society. APM is led by a council or majlis, and it's supported by 11 clusters and domain of knowledge. It's membership by application and not by default. Before we go any further, I would like to address some housekeeping rule. Firstly, please make sure that you are all in silent or muted mode. Secondly, there will be a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. If participants want to ask the speaker, please post your question in the chat box below. Only a few questions will be entertained by the Secretariat due to time constraints. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Datuk Dr. Rahmat Muhammad to moderate the session. Please welcome Datuk Rahmat.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And a very good morning. Salam sejahtera to everyone participating in this very important forum. I would like to acknowledge the presence of our eminent speaker and discussant this morning, Professor Emeritus Dr. Johan Saravanamutu, and fellow utama Dato' Akhtar Zainuddin, and Professor Dr. Effendi Saleh, and members of the Majlis and Academy Professor Malaysia. Welcome to this series of APM Fellow Lecture Series. And we are indeed very honored and privileged this morning to have with us Professor Dr. Johan Saravanamutu, who will be delivering a very important topic. I must say it is very current, and the topic, as mentioned by the MC, the war in Ukraine, implication for Southeast Asia. And may I introduce Professor Johan, who is a renowned international relations specialist, and of course, indeed, a person who is highly qualified to speak on this topic. And a brief biodata of Professor Johan indeed is relevant here. Professor Johan is a Malaysian, of course. He is a political scientist and international relations specialist with a wide international reputation. He is an emeritus professor at University Science Malaysia, adjunct professor at Asia Europe Institute of University Malaya, and adjunct senior fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University. He is, of course, a fellow at the Academy Professor Malaysia. Since June 2003, Professor Johan served as the Dean of the Research Platform on Social Transformation at USM. Professor Johan was also previously Professor of Political Science at the School of Social Sciences, USM Penang, where he served as Dean from 1994 till 1996. Thereafter, in 1997, he was the visiting chair in ASEAN and International Studies at the Center for International Studies, University of Toronto, Canada. His published work include the first major studies of Malaysia's foreign policy published in 1983, the ASEAN Regional Non-Governmental Organization in 1986, and the nexus between industrialization and the institutionalization of authoritarian regime in Southeast Asia, published in 1991. His recent books include Power Sharing in a Divided Nation, Communalism and Politics in 6 Decades of Malaysia's Election, published in 2016. Malaysia's Foreign Policy, the First 50 Years Alignment, Neutralism and Islamization, 2010, and Islam and Politics in Southeast Asia, 2009. Professor Johan obtained his PhD from University of British Columbia after his MA from the University of British Columbia and BSc from University of Singapore. His area of specialization are Malaysian politics and foreign relations, Southeast Asian politics, Southeast Asian regionalism, Islam and politics in Southeast Asia. There you are. Obviously, he's the right person to speak on the subject that today we are going to discuss and deliberate. And of course, joining me will be two discussants, very eminent in their area, the distinguished fellow, Dato Akhtar, and Professor Afandi from UNIZA. I will perhaps later on introduce them when we invite them later. For now, let us hear from Professor Johan Saravaramutu. Please, Professor Johan, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Professor Ahmad, for the very, very kind introduction. And it's very good to have you as my moderator. It's been a long time since we chatted, and we have known each other for a very long time indeed. And I'm sure you will be able to shed some light as well on the topic from the perspective of international law and sanctions. I also welcome our two discussants, distinguished discussants, and I hope they will contribute to the discourse and the discussion after the end of my presentation. So can I move on to our presentation with my first slide? So salam sejahtera and a warm welcome to everybody. First slide. Yeah, so I can move on to the next one. Well, let me start by a preamble about war, and this is a very classic work that was published initially in 1959. All of us who did international relations had to read this. And I think it's still very relevant, Kenneth Walsh's take on why there is war in this world. And essentially, I think he talks about the three images of war, those that blame the individual leaders or human nature, those rooted, the reasons for war, those rooted in states, in the state system and its internal compositions, and the structure of the international system. I think he leans a bit on the last one as the factor why war has not been resolved in this in our world today. But a recent statement by him is actually rather interesting, and I like to read it below there. And this is in his 2021 preface of the book. So the book has been going through many prints, right? So let me just read it. Americans find it hard to believe that other countries may resent and fear America's extending its influence and increasing its control internationally. It is difficult for Americans to imagine or believe that their present preponderance of power, even when accompanied by good intentions, is worrying for states living in its shadow. Man, the state, and war explains how balances result not from the malevolence of men or of states, but from the condition in which states exist, or all states exist. I think that can I have the next slide? That's a very nice introduction or preamble to our topic of the day, which is the war in Ukraine. We've had many wars, not since the Second World War. We will start from there. And of course, many more before that. So the lecture will explain the outbreak of the war in Ukraine. I think many of you already know why it happened, but I will just rehearse with you some of the major antecedents or events that that led to the war and or the Russian invasion, if you like, on the 24th of February of this year, just about a month ago, just over a month ago. I will try to show the differences of positions over the Russian action and the UN vote that was then carried out in the General Assembly. Actually, we'll explain later why it was in the General Assembly and not in the Security Council. And I will explain or give you four major narratives. There could be more, but this is my take, explanatory narratives of why we have the Ukraine war specifically and why there is war generally in this international system or international order of ours. Show the consequences next of the Ukraine war. I think you all may be very familiar with it, but I'll just run through that again. And of course, touch on the implications for our part of the world, Southeast Asia. I think it's very interesting and very important and significant implications for our part of the world. I will actually also, in doing so, present a critique of a very famous article by a man called John Gaddis, the Cold War historian. He calls his piece The Long Peace. And it is actually a take on what the world is for us today. So I'll do a critique of that as well while I'm doing the part on the lessons for Ukraine war for the rest of us, particularly in Southeast Asia. Next slide. So these are the main antecedent events. I mean, there's a lot of words there, but you know essentially that the crisis was an ongoing one. The fact that there was an invasion by the Russians, by Putin or the Russian military in February was actually a continuation of a war that was already started basically in 2014, right? And you saw that Russia had annexed Crimea, and there were two republics that was recognized in the Donbass by the Russian government headed by Putin, and these matters continue to simmer. Ongoing war, in fact, led to about 40,000 deaths, if I'm not mistaken. First of all, I should actually begin by saying, prefacing the lecture by saying I'm no expert on the region. There are many people who are probably experts on the region, but I've sort of picked up my knowledge about it and reading about it as I went along to prepare this lecture. But to me, it's a very familiar scenario, very familiar scenario of why these sorts of wars start in our international system. Can I have the next slide? Now, this is Professor, the picture that you see, and we'll listen to him for a while. This is Professor John Mearsheimer, who is in international relations literature, we'll call him a neo-realist or realist thinker. He has been very critical of the moves that are made by the West, in particular United States of America, with respect to the expansion of NATO. And he sees that basically as a major factor, the geopolitical. So this is a geopolitical image 3 of the Walsian, take on war. This is the geopolitical factor, the way our world is now, that has caused the war. So can we just listen to me briefly?
I'd like to first of all talk about the causes of the present crisis, and I'd like to speculate on where this is all headed. Now, with regard to the causes, I'd like to first of all talk about the causes.
Zul, we can hear that, yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
Of the present crisis, and I'd like to speculate on where this is all headed. Now, with regard to the causes, it's very important to understand that who caused this situation is of tremendous importance because it involves assigning blame. You really have two choices here. You can argue that the West, and especially the United States, caused the crisis, or you can argue that the Russians caused the crisis. But that means that whoever you argue caused the crisis is responsible for this disaster. And it is important to understand that this is a disaster. Ukraine has lost Crimea. It's, in my opinion, going to lose the Donbass. And the only interesting question to me at this point is whether it's also going to lose more territory in the eastern part of its country. Furthermore, Ukraine's economy is wrecked. Its cities are in the process of being wrecked. The international economy is going to be badly affected by these events as they go on. This is going to have terrible consequences, I think, for the Democrats in the fall. Furthermore, it makes it difficult for the United States to pivot out of Europe and pivot to China, where there is a potential threat, which is China. Furthermore, we're driving the Russians into the arms of the Chinese, which makes no sense at all. And all at the same time, we're making Eastern Europe a very unstable region, and therefore forcing us to, if anything, up the ante there. So this is a disastrous situation. So the question of who caused it and who bears the blame really matters. Now, the conventional wisdom in the United States and in the West more generally is that the Russians are responsible for this. And in particular, Vladimir Putin is responsible. As I'm sure almost all of you know, I don't buy this argument at all, and I haven't bought it for a long time. In my opinion, the West bears primary responsibility for what is happening today. And it was largely a result of a decision in April 2006 to make Ukraine and to make Georgia a part of NATO. We were going to integrate Ukraine into NATO come hell or high water. Now, the Russians said at the time that this is categorically unacceptable. The Russians made it clear that they had swallowed
And
the first
I think we
two
can stop there.
tranches of NATO expansion.
Zul,
the 99.
let's stop there here. I think it's quite long, so you get the drift of this. Can I have the next slide? So what Professor Mashayama is saying is, I think is very spot on. The NATO expansion is quite unacceptable from a security perspective, from a Russian perspective. Never mind the individual that's involved, that's put in. And as you know, at the end of the Cold War in 1990, there was almost an agreement, more or less agreement, to say that NATO would not expand, beyond Germany or something of that sort. And now it's expanded way, beyond what was expected. Okay, that's the kind of the third image of war. Geopolitical factors are usually the reason or the condition on which we have wars of this sort. But I think I also like to talk a little bit about the second image. And here, despite my lack of expertise on Ukraine, I like to touch a little bit on recent history in Ukraine and sort of explain to you why the situation internally was also a factor for the war. And as you can see from the map there, the colorful map here, this was the Ukrainian political election of 2010. And the person that won it was a man by the name of Viktor Yanukovych. You see, I can't get the names right. Yanukovych, who was a pro-Russian person, right? But you can see how divided it was. On the other side, you have the reddish, pinkish area, which was controlled by the other party. So it's a very, very divided nation. Of course, as you know, Russians have been in Ukraine for a very, very long time because of the Soviet Union and the Soviet Empire expanding, eastwards to the Eastern European states. So you have the state situation, the second image of war, why you have a problematic, quote unquote, state in terms of the possibility for war. You had the Donbass region, which it had two breakaway, republics, basically Russian, with Russian settlers there. And you have individuals, and here's the first image. You have individuals who are involved in this kind of conflict. So it's a very long story. This is taken from Al Jazeera, which is very good on the war, by the way. It gives you very good insights. And you can see all the personalities are involved. So from one point of view, you can say the first image is not just about human nature, it's also about humans, or the people who attain power and cause political situations to become what they are. So that's so I don't have to go deeply into history. I think you can read about it yourself. Can we go on to the next image? Next slide. This is a little bit more about Ukraine. It's it's a largish country of 42 or 43 million. It's essentially it's not a very developed country. It produces commodities and oil and gas. So that's the kind of economy we have. Of course, in terms of its importance in the region, and also for many parts of the world that depend on primary commodities, it is fairly important. But it's not a super important country in terms of geopolitics, let's put it plainly, right? So the situation in Ukraine is not very different. This is day 15. Actually, I have a day 31, but I think you can see roughly what's happening. In fact, today, with the latest development in Mariupol, is very bad. The humanitarian situation, there are about 150,000 people who are unable to leave. The humanitarian corridor has been blocked and so on. We're not assigning blame here. We're saying that it is a very, very bad situation for Ukraine. And I think this is one of the reasons why Zelensky is now willing to talk about neutrality. Can we go on to the next slide? Just some images of what's going on. I think you've seen for yourself. You can just click on any of these videos and you'll find a horrendous situation from the point of view of the impact on on the humanitarian crisis. Very bad. So can we move on to the next slide? 3 points is just very quickly on that. The latest figure is 3.8 million refugees, right? Very huge number of people have left. And of course, the countries around Ukraine, Poland, Romania, and so on, Moldova, they're all suffering the impact of the refugee crisis. And of course, not forgetting human beings themselves who are suffering. Now, I want to talk about the United Nations and what happened there. So short of having an international organization that can resolve wars, the United Nations, as we all know, any of us who have studied international politics or international relations, was set up after the end of the Second World War. It was far from perfect in terms of its ability to resolve international conflict and wars. There was, however, I think, a realistic recognition of the power balances that existed in the world at that point of time, and indeed even up to today. So essentially, if we're talking about decisions on actions to stop or prevent or to have conflict resolution, etc., in cases of outbreak of war, it is the Security Council that does it, right? Security Council has been given that 15 members of the Security Council, with its permanent members, 5 permanent members, have been given that role. However, this has not been a very effective means to tackle situations of like Ukraine or any other type of war because of the veto power of the, so this is very basic IR 101, right? Of the major. So anything that offends the 5 permanent members and one of them votes against it, you can't get anything going. However, there was a way out of this, and it was created in 1950. It was called Uniting for Peace Resolution. And that resolution had been used quite a few times in order to make decisions about actions in war situations. You take it out of the Security Council and have the vote in the UN Assembly, a General Assembly. So again, about 10 such special sessions have occurred. And the one that I remember most is, of course, the Korean War, in 1950. The Korean War was an American war, but it was sanctioned by the UN. And then it created North and South Korea. And it still remains so, you know. So it was actually, and so was Afghanistan. Afghanistan was also, because of this resolution, Uniting for Peace resolution, it was the US was essentially able, the major hegemon of the world was able to use the United Nations in a manner to make it into a global effort to address the situation of war in these places, or in fact, some would say to even start the war. We have gone to the next slide. We move on to the Ukraine situation, and there was a vote, of course, under Uniting for Peace. All of this text is here, and you can see, although in most Western media they will say overwhelmingly, there was an action. Of course, it was a majority, right? There was still 35 abstentions, and in a sense, it is still a very divided world in terms of how they view this war or this war in in Ukraine, and whether they would be ready to take strong action, such as economic sanctions, against the perpetrator, quote unquote, the war, which is Russia, which started the war. And you will also see that we are very divided across regions, right? You can see, okay, just read within the Asia Pacific region, 2 countries voted against the resolution: Russia itself and North Korea. But I should add, the Myanmar junta also did the same, but they were not in the UN seat. The UN seat is held by Aung San Suu Kyi. So 10 countries have abstained: Bangladesh, China, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Laos, and of course Vietnam, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Tajikistan. These are Mongolia. These are countries that usually have very close relations or military arrangements or purchases of military hardware with Russia, right? So 14 of the Asia Pacific countries not only voted in favor, but co-sponsored the resolution. So you see the division here, and they were Asia Pacific, Australia, Cambodia, of all things, Fiji, Japan, Kiribati, and the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, New Zealand, Palau, and Singapore. Singapore is right there, right? Next slide. So if we zoom in a little bit more from the Asia Pacific into our part of the world, and here are the implications for Southeast Asia of this war. I'm looking at my watch as well. A very divided ASEAN, really, isn't it? We have how they stand. We have sponsors of the UN resolution, Singapore and Cambodia. Cambodia was at pains, or rather Hun Sen was at pains to explain why he did it. He's the chair of ASEAN right now, Cambodia is. And they've had strong relations with Russia, but he went to great pains to explain that, maybe there was some pressure from somewhere, but he went along to become a sponsor of the resolution. And for the resolution, we still have all of ASEAN, essentially, but with 2 abstentions, which are quite significant: Vietnam and Laos. I already mentioned that earlier. And I also mentioned that the Myanmar military junta came out with a strong statement to actually support the Russian action, right? And the only country in our part of the region that is imposing any sanctions at all is Singapore. And Prof. Rama, you can share with us all your ideas on sanctions. In the whole world, actually, there are very few countries that are following the Western sanction policy. In our part of the world, it's Singapore and Korea that's following it. And not all of them are following the full gamut, of sanctions as well. Singapore, I think, takes a very, very strong stand, very close to the US. All right, and the statements here, I don't think I need to read it. A very kind of bland statement on the part of the ASEAN foreign ministers. Basically, ceasefire, don't fight. Singapore's stand is well known, condemning the Russian action and saying why, as a small state, we cannot accept this kind of invasion, right? Territorial rights, territorial integrity. Mind you, from international relations perspective, in terms of the international norms that that keep our world in a bit of order. Territorial integrity and territorial sovereignty is very important. So Singapore is banging on that idea. And nobody has the right to invade accepted territorial boundaries and borders. Then we have the statement from the Prime Minister of Malaysia. Again, I think nothing spectacular, rather bland. I will also share with you a little bit. I had a conversation with our Foreign Minister, Yang Berhormat Dato Saifuddin Abdullah. I was speaking to him about something else. I was asking him about Indonesia-Malaysia relations, and I took the opportunity to ask him about Ukraine war, because I was going to speak to you guys. And he has an interesting anecdote or two. I will talk about it later. That last graph there is the mixed reaction from Vietnamese. I think these are the pro-democracy groups who are not exactly in favor. So each country is kind of divided, right, in many ways, right? But the official stance, of course, also made by the people who are in power. So we have to take that as the official position of the country. Next slide. So these things, I don't even have to go into any great detail. I mean, it's just horrendous, the kinds of things that happen in war. We have experienced, I'll get to that. We also have experienced a lot of wars in our part of the world. So it's a problem that remains a very fundamental, problem of the international order, the world we live in today. We don't have specific figures on the number of deaths, but it's just very bad. You just look at the pictures. I think the good thing is that there were humanitarian corridors. Maybe there is a little bit of, as a constructivist in international relations theory, I would say there's some level of the institutionalization of norms and good behavior, even when it comes to something like war. And we are following some of these norms. In a way, it's slightly against the image of Walt, the first image, human nature. Is that human nature is all bad? Human nature is not all bad. It is sometimes quite good. That's why we are still here. We're surviving. Okay, that's just an aside. And as you can see, the ramifications, we were talking about it just now before we started the webinar. Oil and gas prices have just rocketed. It will affect everybody. Once oil price goes up, we haven't switched to a non-oil economy in the world yet. So it's basically a very oil and gas economy in the world today, plus some nuclear power. And Russia is about one of the largest producers of next to the OPEC countries of oil. So it will impact on everybody. Germany in particular. I think 40% of its energy resources come from Russia. Impact on NATO. Is there going to be an impact on the Russian internal situation? Is there going to be further Russian-China financial collaboration, breakout of the US dollar? Some people call it dollar imperialism, the international system of reserves, trading and so on based on the US dollar. So there are all these things that people start thinking about when a major war like this occurs. Yeah. So there are human, economic, political ramifications, which obviously we cannot even tackle today. It will go well beyond what we can discuss today, depending on how long this war goes on for. Next slide. So here's my two bits of theorizing about war in Ukraine, specific situation there, more or less following on what John Mearsheimer says, but I'm a bit different from him. And also I consider myself to be a constructivist, not a neorealist, but I'm aware of the thinking that's behind the realist and the neorealist school of thought. So the first kind of reason for why, and it's very ably explained by Mearsheimer, NATO expansionism, enlargement, and the Russian insecurity. This is something that's so historical, right? It's been going back for years and years. the Second World War, when there was the invasion of Russia by Germany and so on, and that led to the millions and millions of people being killed there. So that whole thing is so basic, right? And yet the West went ahead with this incredible push for the expansion of NATO. And NATO actually, from an international relations point of view, you can say, what's the purpose of NATO today? There is no Cold War anymore. The world in general is on one page. When a neoliberal economic system, there's no conflict between socialist, a world versus a capitalist world. It's basically just a capitalist world today, right? So what is the reason to have this NATO alliance or a military alliance? And who's the enemy here? Presumably it's just Russia. So some people argue that it's not just to contain Russia, but eventually, in fact, to absorb Russia. But the irony of it that Russia, am I talking too much? The Russia at one point of time was actually interested in joining NATO. Putin was one of them, but he didn't want to have a long discussion, just admit this. But the West was not interested. So there's a lot of disingenuousness on the part of the West with respect to this. And Mashima is absolutely right. Russian expansionism, that's another thesis. This is image 2, right? This is a state which is very, you have an authoritarian leader there. He wants to maybe restore the old Russian Empire, So this is an image 2 argument for why there could be war. And he's not satisfied with what is already present. In fact, Russia actually occupied Georgia for a long time, and it's got a very good friend in Belarus, right? But then it's got Latvia and all these other countries surrounding it. So it's partly image 2 and it's partly image 3. But because of the Putin factor, it can be considered both image 2 and maybe even image 1. And I would say then my preference is for the image 2 and image 3, which is hegemonic contestation and the decline of US hegemony as we speak today. Partly because of the rise of rise of China, and what I call in an article I've written in the book published by what is it now? Routledge? I'm also not sure now. Anyway, hegemonic instability, because there is a theory of hegemonic stability, that the world as we live in needs to have a hegemon. And that hegemon, kind of maintains the rules and order, the games, the rules of the game, as it were. But we are in a period where there's challenges to the hegemonic, situation or position of the US, particularly with the rise of China, which will become the largest economy in the future. And therefore, there's the norms that exist in our world order is being challenged by various new players, major powers, and so on. So these are argued by neuralists and so on. I take the third position, actually, or is it fourth position, which is called the English school for some reason. I think it's a misnomer. The international society one, which is that we have global norms. We have international law, and Prof. Ahmad will probably talk a little bit about it. And this has existed for a fairly long time. And the English school proponents argue that, and including constructivists like myself, argue that global norms lead to a reduction of war, which in itself is an artifact of the anarchical world system. We have an anarchical world system because we cannot enforce international law. I'll wait for the experts to talk more about that. These norms are those of the long peace, which are now currently being challenged. Can I go on to the next slide? The long peace. We are supposed to have had this peace since the end of the Second World War in 1945 when I was born. The Cold War, with all of its rivalries, anxieties, and unquestionable dangers, has produced the longest period of stability in relations among great powers that the world has known in this century. It now compares favorably as well with some of the longest periods of great power stability in all of modern history. We may argue among ourselves as to whether or not we can legitimately call this peace. It is not, I dare say, what most of us have in mind when we use the term. Spot on, John Gaddis. It's not really peace. Next slide. We have, in fact, a mad world. Nuclear equilibrium. Two superpowers with roughly equal nuclear weapons to destroy the world about 10 or 20 times over. Nuclear weapons equilibrium is the practice of MAD, mutually assured destruction. And the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world on its brink. And thanks to Khrushchev, actually, he withdrew the missiles from Cuba, right? So we didn't have a nuclear war. And then the partial test ban treaty of 1963 actually ensures that we don't continue with this mad way of testing nuclear weapons and everybody wanting to become a nuclear power. The French actually stopped that in 1996 amidst a lot of protests. And the vast majority of countries in the world are now party to the non-proliferation treaty. So there is some kind of norm within this so-called long peace idea, but I'm kind of a bit critical of this. For example, you have non-signatories: India, Pakistan, Israel. It's probably a nuclear state like Israel, right? It probably has nuclear weapons. South Sudan, I don't know why. And then you have the recognized powers, nuclear powers, who already become nuclear powers before this NPT was there, who are not really true parties to this NPT, but they are supposed to act responsibly. And not supposed to create more, escalate the nuclear situation. Next slide. And we have, I would say, what we live in is essentially still this world, rules of superpower game. Now the superpowers may shift here and there, but essentially we have this superpower political game that's going on. There are spheres of influence that you saw how Russia cannot afford to lose its sphere of influence. And NATO wants to expand its sphere of influence, etc., etc. But nuclear weapons have not been used, not since Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There's what is called predictable anomaly over unpredictable rationality. This is, I think, John Gaddis's terminology. But we have created a divided, states. We created Germany, we created Vietnam last time, but now, we've created two Koreas. I think that the people are talking about the scenario of a divided Ukraine, just like North and South Korea. In the past, we have North and South Vietnam. And of course, you still have, you probably will see that situation arising. That's my kind of prediction. And continuing proxies war all across the globe. One superpower against the other, but on a terrain that's not their own, So we have emergence of new nuclear powers, which makes the world even more unstable, continuous spending on nuclear weapons. North Korea is an interesting case. And then we are no more closer, I would say, to a genuine situation of peace in the year 2020 than we were at the end of World War II. Wars occur because, it's my own little quote here, because we still do not have a global institutional means to stop them. Next. And look at the wars that we've had, past and present. I don't even have to read to you, right? Continuous. And the human consequences of war, continuous. 82.4 million people are now displaced. This is from the Crisis Center, but quoting my own, Uppsala was where I went to for sabbatical. I know Professor Peter Wallenstein from there. They collect very good data on conflict. War, civil strife, continues. An estimated 447 people were killed in conflicts in 2020, very recently. Next. And to our region now. I'm looking at my watch. I have still some time. Southeast Asia is no stranger to war. We've had many wars, interstate, internal, and interstate and internal. I mean, those are the types of wars we've had. Started with the Malaysia-Indonesia confrontasi. And of course, the big one was the Vietnam War. Then you had the Cambodian-Vietnamese War that followed from the end of the Vietnam War. And then you also had the Chinese invasion of Vietnam, teach them a lesson war in 1979, right? But it fizzled out. We have had wars internally. I just gave some examples. The Aceh one was very long. The Deep South one internal, these are internal wars, yeah? Within different groups within the state. So this is the second image idea. Wars will continue because of this failure of the nation state to contain either its internal situations or to allow the internal situation to sort of move out and cause wars. The Bangsa Moro one is very interesting. I've studied it, I've written about it. There has been a peace accord, and Malaysia was actually primarily responsible for the goodwill and the peace negotiations and so on for a very long time. The Myanmar one is just horrendous. It's going to go on. I was talking to Prof. Ahmad about it. Maybe we should have a webinar on this. And we do have, from the constructivist perspective, the ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which was formed in 1967, as a pluralistic security community which has basically stopped interstate wars in our region. And in a way, it's preventing wars from happening by not engaging major powers, right? So the lessons are becoming very kind of clear now. We have kept the major powers out of our terrain in ASEAN. So far, so good. So since the 1976 Bali Accords, Treaty Amnesty Cooperation prevents the occurrence of interstate wars. We have seen that. Internal wars, of course, will continue. Once in a while, there'll be a skirmish between Thailand and Cambodia and all that kind of thing, but no major thing. So the zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality, sorry for the spelling, it went a bit haywire, is a Malaysian idea. Thanks to who, Tun Dr. Ismail. He was the first man in 1968. It's all in my book on foreign policy to suggest this. And it became our pivotal foreign policy, and it became adopted as a policy of the ASEAN states. And that sort of keeps our region neutral and peaceful. And of course, we also have this thing called the Southeast Asian. I've written about this too. A nuclear weapon-free zone. I think we should continue to maintain it. But you see, these major powers, they're not interested in guaranteeing you all this stuff. So you have to look after yourself, as it were. You have to create the norms within your own system and prevent the external factors from affecting those internal norms that you create for your region. So I put there at the bottom, constructivist scholars posit, let's say from an article of mine, that ASEAN over time evinces an agency in crafting its own regional institutions and norms to leverage on the notion of ASEAN centrality in stabilizing regional politics into the 21st century. Next slide. So, actually, I'm coming to the end. This is the end. Now, it's very clear the implications of what's going on in Ukraine for us in Southeast Asia. And I should just add the anecdote that I had a conversation with our foreign minister. I think he's very on top of the situation. He said when this war broke out in Ukraine, Malaysia was kind of watching its P's and Q's. And what surprised him, he said, or surprised Malaysia and him, was that in the United Nations vote, UAE abstained. He says, there's something here. Why is it they abstain, So he then realized that UAE had strong relations with Russia. And maybe there's also an oil factor, I don't know. But the fact is that I think Malaysia was also watching the situation. Malaysia, as we know, we've been non-aligned, fairly neutral, although we are often considered to be somewhat in a Western orbit, right? We have a Commonwealth arrangement called the Five-Power Defense Arrangement, right? Which was, of course, a legacy of the British, period, and also the Confrontasi. So we do have military arrangements, if not alliances, with the West. But I think over time, as I've argued in pieces of writing, we have maintained a very strong, since Tun Razak, strong non-aligned position. And we are actually one would even argue that we are one of the primary movers of this, along with Indonesia, within the ASEAN community, or the ASEAN social formation, call it if you like, to maintain this kind of neutrality. We should continue practicing this, given the clear deleterious effects of being close to one side. So we should try to maintain active neutralism, which is an old term, activeness. The major non-aligned countries of the world, like Yugoslavia, now no more, used to be Tito, and then Nehru under India under Nehru, they were the ones that propounded. Of course, Sukarno to some extent, but he was a little bit more on the other side. This idea of being neutral, active, and not being part of the major power war game, a war situation, war kind of scenarios. Avoid military alliances, develop autonomous economic strength, which is easier said than done, given our very globalized world order. Reduce political and economic dependence on major powers. Again, very tall order. We another talk, but we have very strong relationship with China right now. And China has become basically, I would say, the major hegemon of the region. So we have to be kind of very careful. I think most international relations analysts have said we have to be hedging our relationships with China, maintain hedge diplomacy, which is the next point, and practice it. So not being drawn to major power contestations and conflict, but sometimes not too easy in the South China Sea to do this sort of thing, right? We're already drawn in. So how do we position ourselves? So there are all these kinds of considerations when we get into the nitty-gritty of things. But these are the broad lessons, including the final one, which is obviously an unfinished work in progress. Institute process of conflict management, conflict resolution in Southeast Asian interstate internal conflicts, the biggest one being Myanmar. We haven't resolved it. We have tried through various means to stop our internal wars. Malaysia, as I said, was very, very important in the Bangsamoro conflict. But that again is not an ASEAN instrumentality. It is actually it's like goodwill among ASEAN countries. Let's all go in and help. And in fact, there was also the Marawi siege with the ISIS, coming in, and Malaysia, Indonesia, and all these countries were also participating in that to stop that unfortunate development in this part of the world. So it's all ad hoc at the moment. There isn't anything that is, the TAC and all, they've never been used, you see. The actual instrumentality of peaceful resolution of conflict that exists in the ASEAN structure has never actually been used because it's difficult, given the wide differences, the divides that we have politically within ASEAN today. But so far, so good, and I think we should continue with this as far as possible. So with that, I'd like to end my talk today.
Thank you very much, Professor Johan. I think without doubt, you have taken us to a very important. I think this has been a very good discussion. Your take on the reason why Russia must do something to perhaps restore its former glory, and I think I will not perhaps make any comment at the moment, because we still have to very distinguished discussion to further elaborate on the topic. First, let me invite the distinguished fellow Dato Muhammad Akhtar Ahmad Zainuddin, perhaps a brief introduction. Dato Akhtar is currently the director of the Center of Academic and International Networking, University Pertahanan Nasional Malaysia. Previously, he served in the Air Force for 30 years as a fighter jet pilot, retired in January 2006. He later held several top management positions at Kementah or Kementerian Pertahanan in the field of logistic, procurement, human resources, and operation. He has also served for 5 years in the private sector with international and local companies, that is the aviation industry. And of course, he is a member of the Academy professor. So I must say that Dato Akhtar, you are the security experts. Perhaps you can highlight on why the invasion of Russia and the military point of view, perhaps. And I will let you have the floor now, and you have about 15 minutes to discuss on the topic. Please take the floor.
Assalamualaikum. Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Rahmat. I also like to take this opportunity before I start to thank Academy Professor Malaysia for this opportunity for me and the National Defence University to participate in the discussion. Thank you to the speaker, Emeritus Professor Dr. Johan, for an enlightening outlook on the war in Ukraine. I would probably fulfill my function as a discussion on, around 3 points for maybe Dr. Johan to take up or to elaborate on. The first point is the discussion on the concept of war itself. You know, if we study warfare per se, and we break it up into historical periods, war, you know, back in the ancient warfare period, in more than 400 BC ago with the Greeks and the Spartans, and then we move into the medieval warfare from 476 AD right up to the late 15th century. 1,000 years of war where human beings were killing each other as they develop and as they progress in technology, science, and arts, and as they have new affiliations to religion, race, and clanship. So 1,000 years of warfare by the humankind in the medieval ages. Then we move into the industrial age of warfare, which technically started from the mid-19th century to the end of the Second World War, where nation states got very organized, and nation states and industries were then involved in war. We fought 2 world wars in this industrial warfare period, and there was they coined this terminology that we now have developed, total warfare, as in world wars. Post-World War, as the speaker highlighted, there were many wars after the world was technically at peace in 1945, and you hear new jargons like proxy wars, coalition wars. The fact remains, though, that the humankind, as we develop into a modern age today, we are still fighting wars. If 8 million soldiers in uniform, let alone the displacement of civilians, 8 million soldiers in uniform around the world died in the First World War, around the same number, about 8 million soldiers all over the world have actually died in skirmishes around the world since the world was technically at peace after 1945 to this day. So in effect, we've actually fought a 3rd World War, whether we realize it or not. Now, why I am raising this is because it now raises a philosophical debate that maybe war has been ingrained over more than 2,000 years of fighting and killing each other. War has been ingrained into the DNA of the human being. If you subscribe to this philosophy, then you would think that the world will never at peace, that eventually there will be war of some kind. Yesterday it was Syria and Afghanistan, today is Ukraine, tomorrow we don't know what. So this is because of the intricacies of the human being and nation states to satisfy their aspirations in politics, in doctrinal beliefs, in economics, in racial and religious affiliations, it is just too difficult for the entire human race to satisfy all these criteria. And these are, by the way, reasons for the different wars. Now, Southeast Asia is, or ASEAN, is not exempted to this. If you subscribe to this philosophical idea that warring is in our DNA, then there would be an imminent war in this region. Hopefully not, but there would, if you subscribe to this philosophy. We have a flashpoint in the South China Sea. We have military presence. Nation states are spending more than 2% of their GDP to establish their defense posture. And as I said, it's a flashpoint. So what? So my view is that if it is a DNA issue, if the human being is programmed over more than 2,000 years to kill each other, we now should focus on the mechanisms to prevent war. Now, Dr. Sofyan have actually mentioned that the weak link between the international mechanism, i.e. the link between the United Nations Assembly and the United Nations Security Council, and somehow things doesn't work as a mechanism to prevent war. We in ASEAN, I think, should focus on the mechanisms that we have. We should explore the boundaries of the ARF, the ASEAN Regional Forum, apart from being an economic setup, and whether it can also be used as a mechanism to prevent war. So that's one interesting point. Although philosophical, it can get down to a practical implication, and we'd like to hear the speakers comment on this. The second point is this buzzword that is going around the defense and security community today called national resilience. National resilience, if you like, is a more holistic view of national defense and security, where it encompasses all elements of national power for your state's well-being. And one of the major components of national power is, of course, economics. Economics is a major component in the search for national resilience. So I put to you that the 141 votes that was submitted in the United Nations Assembly to go against the Russian invasion of Ukraine is actually a signal, a resemblance of nation states' national resilience to stay within the economic ecosystem of the world. Today, we see Russia being cut off, isolated from the world, and therefore 141 nations in this country, actually including the 35 that abstain, are also thinking of their national resilience issues on how to sustain their national resilience to support for or against a particular motion in the United Nations. Therefore, if you adopt this idea and concept of national resilience, you can also deduce that the term superpower today is no more affiliated to nuclear strength per se, but the term superpower is tagged to the nation that has the greatest influence on the global economic ecosystem. ASEAN and Southeast Asia cannot afford to be excluded from the global economic system, and therefore it questions a lot of the policies that we have put out in the world today. In fact, the ZOP policy in 1971 has gone through evolutions or variations to conform to the global economic ecosystem. That's an interesting point, which we'd like the speaker to address and explore or elaborate on. The mad world is actually off the table. Mad, mutual, assured destruction of the world is not in the formula of things. If the world is destroyed, then everybody lose anyway. So therefore, I think nation states are moving towards the survivability issue, putting man out of the equation and getting more and more a piece of the pie to develop their national resilience. But that's the second point. For the third and final point, is actually on economic sanctions. Thus far, prior to Ukraine, economic sanctions were used as a tool for diplomacy. In the event of war, economic sanctions eventually became a byproduct of warring nations. But today, in the Ukraine scenario, from the defense perspective, we see economic sanctions being used as a weapon of war. There are no boots on the ground. The United States is rallying support. The United States, a nation which has control over the global economic system, is garnering support to cut Russia out of the world. Whether this works or not is yet to be seen. It has to be highlighted that in the medieval age, when warring parties were conquering castles and fortresses, they did the same strategy where they encircle castles and fortresses until the folks within the containment are not able to survive, and then they surrender, as opposed to bombing them or attacking them. We see today that the Western countries, led by the United States, is employing economic sanctions as a weapon of war. To put things in perspective, if in the 1940s, nation states were afraid and therefore towed the line to suffer the same fate as Hiroshima and Nagasaki, today nation states would be cautious to be the pariah of the world and go into total bankruptcy and therefore put their nations into array. That's my view on the current state. And these are, as I said, three points that I hope the speaker can highlight or elaborate on. I think ASEAN and Southeast Asia will survive if it stays on the right side of the global ecosystem. That is the safe bet. Thank you very much. 10 minutes plus. Back to you, Datuk Rahmat.
Thank you, Dato' Akhtar. Excellent articulation on 33 points. I suppose that one of it is on sanction. I will make my intervention after Professor Effendi delivered his points later, and I will speak a bit on sanction because I've written a recent article on that in the Straits Times. But now may I invite Professor Dr. Effendi Saleh to present his case on the subject. But before that, may I briefly introduce Professor Effendi. Professor Effendi is a professor at the Faculty of Law and International Relations at University Sultan Zainal Abidin, or UNIZA, and has served as the Deputy Dean and before that was the Deputy Vice Chancellor, Student Affairs. And he is an activist of humanitarian care in Malaysia, or My Care, and he has been actively involved in many international humanitarian missions, particularly in crisis areas such as in Gaza, Syria, Lebanon, South Sudan, and Cambodia. And he is a member of academic professor. Professor Effendi, please make your presentation. Thank you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you, Prof. Dato' Rahmat. And Alhamdulillah. And we have our distinguished Emeritus Professor here, Dr. Johan. And also we have a fellow utama, Dr. Akhtar. And I would like to thank to IPM to invite me to join this for me is a very excellent discussions, and then I really appreciate that. I would like to respond on the Prof. Johan lecture, probably, and then try to conclude with my own opinion based on 3 or 4 points. First, about the cause of war, based on the realism or the realist theory. I know the Prof. Johan is a constructivist, and I'm also, you know, pro-constructivist. But to explain about the war in Ukraine, it seems to me that the realist theory is more valid, and is more enlightening for us to understand about the crisis in Europe now. And my argument mostly based on the John Meshmere, probably my pronunciation is not correct, and Prof. Johan already showed us some video clips on the John Meshmere opinions about Ukraine war. Yeah, the argument of the John Meshmere mostly in his book, the Tragedy of Great Power Politics, published in 2001. It is about the offensive realism or aggressive realism, and it's probably the extensions of so many writers on the realist theory. Probably the Thucydides, the Athenians, the historian or the Athenian historians that wrote about Peloponnesian War in Athens, tried to justify war in Athens in ancient Greece. Then based on 5 assumptions, then I see still valid about these assumptions. You know, John Meshmere popularized about these 5 assumptions. First, about the international system is anarchic, and the great powers are the main actors. Second, all great powers possess offensive military capabilities, which they use against or deter each other. Yeah, that's why we heard about nuclear treaty agreements, about MAD. Yeah, and third, states cannot be sure that other states will not use military capabilities against them. Yeah. Fourth, the primary goal of state is survival. This is most important points, I think, assumptions about the primary goal. The primary goal of state is to survive. And the fifth point is states are rational unitary actors who think strategically about how to pursue the primary goals, which is survival of the states. So in this regard, Prof. Johan already mentioned, already briefly discussed about how Russia perceive the threat from the NATO expansion. Yeah, and I try to discuss how these 5 assumptions lead to the crisis of in Ukraine, war in Ukraine, that I think is largely because of the expansion from NATO, and the expansion of NATO, which is currently is a hot topic discussed all over the world, especially among the international relations professors, yeah, or academicians. But interestingly, after the demise of Soviet Union in 1990s, the discussions of expansion of NATO was also a hot topic. Yeah, so many professors, institutions, for example, Brookings Institute, also discuss about the expansion of NATO, pro and cons. Yeah, and we know, Prof. Johan also mentions that the NATO is a military alliances, is military organizations, and why we still need NATO now. Is communist, socialist, USSR is already destroyed, is already ended. So while the Western powers, led by the Americans, still need the NATO, yeah, after 1990s, and on top of that, the NATO expand, yeah, to the former Soviet Union countries. And then this is something that interesting to be discussed, how the Russia perceived is a threat for them, yeah, for their security, for their survival. Then we know that NATO is a principal instrument of U.S. foreign policy in Europe, yeah, and NATO is a military organization. So the way of their thinking is about military operation probably, and before this or after the collapse of Soviet Unions, probably we discussed NATO is a peacemaker, is doing peacemaking inside Europe. But unfortunately, also we can see that NATO is doing something war fighting outside Europe, yeah, and Prof. Johan mentions about we have a long peace in the world, yeah, but the connotation long peace is in the world is in Europe or all over the world. We can see that, and Prof. Johan himself showed us how many wars, yeah, took place or is also still going on in the world now, yeah. So is it long peace in the world, in Europe, long peace in Europe, but the rest of the world we have so many wars, yeah. So this is kind of the paradox of what we can see in Europe, but and the rest of the world in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Libya, in Iraq, in Palestine, yeah, and also so many countries in Africa. And the discourse about the expansion of NATO, yeah, is already started after the collapse of Soviet Unions, and even the American President Bill Clinton initiated the Partnership of Peace in 1996, if I'm not mistaken. He tried to develop relationship with and strengthen the former Soviet Union states and war Soviet country, which is located in Eastern Europe. And then we can see this is how the Russian responds to these expansions, or the way that United States tried to do during that time, during the Bill Clinton. Then for the American who led the NATO, yeah, the logic is better to have a larger and stronger NATO rather than to try to counter a Russian threat. So in the discussions after the post-Soviet Union, they still perceive that Russia has a threat to the Western Bloc. Yeah. So for them, NATO is still what we can say is still a valid military alliances, and still to be seen as a factor to maintain peace and stability in Europe. Yeah, and then but there's a strong arguments against the idea of the expansion of NATO. They also discuss in America. They see that these expansions will alienate Russia, and in the process, it will diminish security in Europe. This is one argument. And the second argument, and I think it's still valid until now, yeah, it will provoke a hostile Russian reaction and dividing Europe. Yeah. So the discourse in America after the collapse of the Soviet Union is about the expansion of NATO and the consequences of the expansions. And some of them, view that the expansion of NATO will lead to a war, a new war in Europe. This is this discourse, the discussion in 1990s, yeah, after the collapse of Soviet Union. And then, as you can see, the Prof. Johan also mentions about the expansion of NATO to Eastern Europe, yeah, is unacceptable. For example, in 2008, yeah, when the NATO declared in a conference in Romania, in Budapest, that NATO welcomes Ukraine and Georgia for membership, immediately Putin declared that NATO is a direct threat to Russia. Means that the Western alliance, the military alliance, is a direct threat to Russian survival or Russian security. So if we can understand this from the realist point of view about the survival of Russia, about the geopolitics, yeah, we can understand why Russia, you know, try to, well, they invaded already, yeah. So and then we can understand why Putin took this stand or took this this policy, yeah, going to war, and then Meshpia, you know, blames America for this war, because for him, the America understand very much about the consequences. It's happened in Cuba Missile Crisis when Soviet Union put their missile in Cuba, just 90 kilometers from American territory. Then the response from the America is very harsh. Yeah, is in the brink of the war. Then we can see what the reaction from the NATO, the alliances of America, and the response from the rest of the world during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So for me, the America knows very well what's going to happen if they expand the membership to Eastern Europe up to Ukraine. So it's like the enemy just standing in front of your door now. Yeah. Yeah. My second point is about my third point is about the response of the consequences of the war. It's about refugees. This is something that for me is an eye-opener for the world, that the refugees, yeah, is not only happen in Asian countries or in African countries. It's happening in Europe now, yeah, and we can see that millions, is almost 4 million refugees from Ukraine, yeah, and they are in Europe now, somewhere in Europe, in Poland, yeah, in borders, yeah, and then the Europeans now taste what they are not taste before, or what they are not taste. They have taste before. During the Second World War, First World War, but it's already 40 years, or it's long ago, and now it's happening in Asia. It's happening in Libya. It's happening in Iraq, and they can understand that until they what's happening in Ukraine now. Yeah, but still the issues of how to manage the refugees in Europe, when they cannot comprehend it or feel it for the last 40 or 60 years. Yeah, this is something new for the Europeans, how they can contain it, how they can manage the refugees. I experienced it in Jordan, the refugees in the refugees camp, Palestinian refugees camp. Is disaster, is so bad. Yeah, so but they can manage it well in that way. But how the Ukraine or the European can manage the Ukraine refugees in Europe, we still cannot see the plan, how to manage the refugees in the future, or currently, or in the future. Yeah. My fourth point is about the response of Muslim countries. This is very interesting. And last week I just read a news, American news. I'm not in the portal. Pat Robertson, one of the leaders of evangelicals, they perceive or they see this war is something to do with the religion. Yeah, he said that this is being compelled by God, and then it's a war to bring about the end time. He's talking about end time. The Christians talking about the end times, And interestingly, the Muslim in some part of the world, even in Malaysia, some of my friends also talk about the war in Ukraine is something to do with religion. When the Chechen Muslim military, they involved in the war, they say they try to relate with the prophecy of some hadith, end time hadith. Yeah, they say there is the war before the end times, and this is something that we also have to look at deeply, how the religion gives some perspective about the war, and then they try to make the judgments or assumptions about the war, and also make a stand. Yeah, for them, some of them believe that Russia is a Rome, it's a new Rome that mentions in the hadith, and we should support the Russians. Yeah, and there is the hadith that Russians, the Romans will ally with Muslim army, and then against the enemy of God, and after that they will divide and against each other, and after that the Dajjal, the Jesus coming down again, and then there will the end time. So for the layman, the discourse of the Ukraine war is also related to the religion. Yeah, they made a stand. They try to justify, and try to make a stand to support which country or to against which country. Yeah, and the evangelical also sees or perceive the war is on behalf of their theology, or based on their theology, the end time theology, that they see that what is doing now is something that part of the God plan. Yeah, so this is something interesting. Yeah, how the religion involved in the war, and then how the leaders of the religions, for example, in America, yeah, the evangelical leaders, they propagate the idea of this based on the prophecy about the war in Ukraine, and related with the Christianity. This all from me. Thank you.
Okay, right. Thank you. Oh, just in time. Thank you so much for the interesting input, and the 4 points that Prof. Johan will have to respond from your deliberation. But since Prof. Johan asked me to respond to the issue on sanction, perhaps I'll just take a few minutes on this, yeah, if you may permit me. Dato Akhtar mentioned about sanction, and in fact, I've written an article in the New Straits Times on sanctions and how does sanction affect countries. My article that I have written in the New Straits Times hovers around 2 points. First, despite the successful imposition of sanction by US and its allies against Russia, I think we have to look at the legitimacy of this sanction. Although it has been used rightly since World War I, World War II, it has been, as mentioned by Dato Akhtar, is a very effective diplomacy tool. But however, if we look at the international law aspect of it, the legitimacy of it, I think there are a lot of things that one will have to really understand. And if you look at the sanction, it can be unilateral in its form, it can be multilateral in its form. Unilateral means one country imposing sanction to another country, and it does have its implication on third countries. And unilateral sanction is not very much, is very debatable, because the only one that is been recognized by the UN Charter, I must say, is the multilateral sanction under Article 7 of the UN Charter. That can be used if it gets a sanction from the UN Security Council. So we know very well that that is not possible, as mentioned by Prof. Johan rightly, that UN Security Council is actually being dominated by the P5. So one of them can easily can waive the veto powers. So when that is done, then nothing can happen. No resolution can be taken up or being passed. So that is why, that's the reason why most of these multilateral sanctions cannot be, you can't get that resolution from the UN Security Council. It's either being vetoed by one of the P5, that's the end of it. So that is why most of the time it is used unilaterally. So the permissibility or the legitimacy of that unilateral sanction is debatable, is being questioned. I've written a few articles on this. My stand is very clear. I said that unilateral sanction is impermissible under international law by virtue of course, UN Charter. The other aspect of sanction is when it involves humanitarian issues. Now, of late, a lot of literature has been written on sanction going against humanitarian rights. This has been, in fact, discussed, debated, and resolved by the UN Human Rights Council. And based on this position, sanction goes against the idea of very old maxim in Latin, which says ex injuria jus non orito, or what it means simply is that legal rights cannot derive from illegal acts. Legal rights cannot derive from illegal acts. So the illegal act would be the act that is illegal under humanitarian laws. So this occurred in many countries that has been sanctioned by US and its ally, namely Iraq, Libya, Syria, Iran, of course, and there is also issues. Right to live is as one of the important elements under humanitarian law. So if these acts are illegal, if sanctions, this sort of sanction amounts to legality, therefore it cannot derive, it cannot be said to be legal. So these are the two aspects of sanctions that I've written in my article. Now, the other thing that I would like to say is what is happening around the world at the moment, especially the under the aegis of the UN. Now, we know very well that the 300 years old of the Westphalian law, or what we have at the moment, international law, cannot hold waters tightly, because we know the principle of non-intervention and state sovereignty are the two very important pillars that has been used, abused by many countries. One of it, of course, is Myanmar, obviously using non-intervention principle as a very good point for not allowing other countries to intervene with their internal policies. So what is needed is that from League of Nations right up to the UN. Now there is this global promise or covenant which say that stop war. War is illegal. But why do we have war? So this is one issue that until today, UN Charter is not able to solve these worldly issues of war. And, despite the fact that it says that they want to make war illegal. But you have then again Article 51 of the UN Charter, which give the right for state to defend themselves. So what does it mean? So it simply means that if war is inevitable, then you have the right of defense, right to be defended. And this is provided under Article 51 of the UN Charter. So very unfortunate that this event. So what we should be thinking now is, can we reimagine United Nations without the P5? Of course, this is very academic in its nature, because the realists, as propagated by Professor Effendi, will not agree on the idea that P5 should be abolished, there should be reform in the UN Security Council, so on and so forth. So that is one example. But what is happening at the moment, this ICC of the Rome Statute, the International Criminal Court has already taken the investigation on the alleged crime committed in the context of situation in Ukraine since 21st November 2013. I think this is Mr. Han, the prosecutor, has already taken up this issue. The other thing is that ICJ has already made their decision only as to provisional measures, because there will be a pending case in, I think, maybe next year, to discuss on the legality, or because Ukraine asked ICJ that Russia is guilty under the Convention of Genocide. Provisionally, ICJ had made that decision that they want Russia to stop all the acts, the genocide, or the act, military operation, and also other war crime, so on and so forth. So at least these United Nations, under United Nations aegis, the ICJ at least is making a right move in declaring that hopefully all these are against international criminal law. So that much I would like to say. Thank you so much for the opportunity. So back to Professor Johan to respond to the two discussions. Please have the floor, Professor Johan.
Thank you very much, Prof. Ahmad. I won't take too long. I think both discussants have been very learned in their comments, so I don't really have to discuss what they raise so much as to kind of the poses that, for example, Nato Akhtar has given us, the philosophical debate, and how it then, relates to our particular situation. I think I enjoyed that very much, Professor Akhtar. Your idea that we have been in a third world war is actually very much my own view when I critique the long piece of John Geddes. I presented a keynote address at SMU about 4 years ago. I said there's no peace in the world. The war is going on continuously, and you're absolutely right. It's call them the third world wars, they have been there continuously. I do, however, take issue with you about this question of the human DNA. The scientists are really investigating this genome, right? Human genome thing. I don't know whether they'll find a war gene or not. Do we have a war gene? That's the one that you're more or less racing. My view is more that quite similar to Mashamaya. Again, I don't know whether I'm pronouncing his name correctly. And that is the international system is basically at fault here. But then who created the international system? Human beings, right? Human being created. Who created the state, the Westphalian state system? Which, by the way, people think is a bit of a myth to think that we are in a world of nation states, right? The world is much more mixed than that of just nation states. And that's another comment, actually. Sorry, it's an aside from the point that I'm supposed to be answering. The world is a mixed place in terms of the kinds of units that exist. And maybe we should begin to recognize that. And that sort of maybe answers a little bit about the DNA question, but also maybe Effendi's points, that there are nation states, there are subnational states, there are supranational states, there are civil society groups. There, increasingly we have supranational solidarities, which are across nations. So it's very interesting. So in other words, the manner in which our international norms are being constructed, so I'm a constructivist, is also changing. And the way they're being constructed, if I may be allowed to argue, is based on not that very, the Hobbesian view of man, which is that man is all basically bad. He cannot cooperate. It's based on the idea that we have cooperated. I don't know, have you all been reading Yuval Harari and the whole idea that we have had organization, we have had, UN, we have had the UN, far from perfect. Rahma, you're absolutely right. But the fact that we do have these kinds of organizations shows that there is a kind of impetus within humanity for wanting to have structures, global arrangements, and so on, which are based on humanitarian, call it what you will, but norms which help to promote the human progress, put it plainly, right? But this, and of course, human progress has been occurring. Otherwise, we won't be sitting here and talking with this fantastic, multimedia facility called Zoom. So there's been a lot of progress in science and technology and so on. But along with that, we have this very basic human. Well, I suppose it could be a gene thing, that causes us to fight conflict, to have these kinds of quarrels which lead to major developments like war. So just to make it a bit more practical, because you mentioned at the end, does ASEAN have the mechanisms to prevent war? I think Prof. Akhtar, you mentioned that. No, at the moment, it is very weak. I think I mentioned that at the end of my lecture. However, the steps have started to do so, and the intentions are good. The intentions are good. And the core group within ASEAN, I would say, I think Indonesia is very important. Indonesia is the middle power of ASEAN, right? Malaysia is a kind of aspirant, middle power, as it were, but we come up with very good ideas. So these are the countries that can actually push ASEAN forward with this agency. There was a question by Sharifah Munira. Has ASEAN agency failed in the case of Myanmar? It has. However, even in the earlier crisis of Myanmar, there was a constructive engagement, which helped to keep things in control until everybody thought they were on the road to democratic change, right? Aung San Suu Kyi and all that. However, that collapsed because of the deep state, the military deep state. So we have that problem. But within the ASEAN mechanism, I think within the ASEAN social formation, I think we have the means to develop it further. Again, I'm the eternal optimist. I know there are all kinds of problems with that. We certainly need experts like Prof. Rahmat to tell us how to go ahead with the international sort of rules and games, rules and norms that we have to inculcate within this region and to develop those. I think your question was ARF, can it be changed to something, right? That is a bit more hands-on. It's now just a talk shop. So it's what we call, what you call is not megaphone diplomacy, but something of that, public diplomacy rather than a means by which we can really truly engage in dealing with certain kind of issues that need to be resolved at a nitty-gritty level. There are mechanisms, mind you. So if you look at the South China Sea, I'm also looking at my watch. The South China Sea, there is an ongoing dialogue with China. There's an ASEAN initiative. I think it's very important. They're into a draft treaty to look at a code of conduct. So these are all good things that are going on. That also shows that there's agency within ASEAN. to be able to, if not resolve, at least to manage conflict. So conflict sometimes has to be managed if they cannot be fully resolved. So that's my quick answer to you. That you also have the point about national resilience. I cannot disagree with you. I think at the end of the day, economic resilience, or your survival as a nation state based on your economic capacity, is the one that counts when you vote. So that's why a lot of countries did do that according to their national needs, right? National needs is driving the reason why you act politically. So I agree with you there, but that doesn't mean that the other kind of developments cannot go on. Is MAD off the table? You also mentioned it is in a sense, but that is the position of John Geddes. Meaning to say, if we have MAD, we're okay. But I'm not super confident that this thing can go on and on and on. Because there are new nuclear states coming, new kids on the block. North Korea wants to be a new kid on the block, right? So you never know when an accident can happen, when something crazy will occur. And in fact, the Ukraine war is at that brink of something like this happening. Consider the scenario that NATO, suppose this war doesn't end. I mean, they're just posing this, right? Suppose this Putin continues and he doesn't want to give in, he doesn't want to negotiate for a settlement. Is NATO going to continue like that, or is it going to do something? Is it going to participate in the war? Once NATO participates in the war, we are in for a very, very serious situation. The nuclear break. Worse, much worse than the Cuban Missile Crisis. No? The Cuban crisis was nothing. It was just Khrushchev putting a few missiles in Cuba, and he didn't succeed. This one, we have an ongoing war going on. All right. So I don't think it's totally off the table, but you're right in the sense that the economic kind of questions, the survival questions are important. Thanks, Dr. Fendi, for your very interesting support of Mashmaya. I don't disagree. Offensive realism. Eh? But you see, this Mashamai man, he's very bright, he's sharp and everything. But you know what his agenda for America is? Contain China. Don't worry about Russia, right? Russia is not your problem, Biden. The real enemy out there, sorry, I'm exaggerating a bit. The real problem is China. So it's an endless kind of thing, his thinking, right, is in this loop of the realist loop. You keep having to do this offensive realism. You keep looking out for your greatest enemy. My take on it is that American hegemony is actually diluted now. It's clearly on the decline. And in fact, if you read Foreign Affairs even, which is a journal of the American intellectuals, I call them, you get John Nye and all these people talking about the end of the American hegemony. So we are in effectively a more multipolar world. Mashamaya may be actually arguing that the US still has to maintain this kind of control, although not clear, and that the rising hegemon is China, and therefore the one to watch out for is not Russia. It's a small fry. Look at China. China's going to be the next enemy. So again, that kind of image of the world, I'm not saying that it's not. Probably it's true. It could be true, but I'm not particularly invested in that kind of thinking, right? I'm more in the constructivist vein of thinking, how do we get out of this order? And in fact, I've written an article called Post-Hegemony. We have to look towards post-hegemony, where we don't have this superpower control of our world, right? And of course, easier said than done. All the third world, all these other countries get together and do your bit and contain the power of the superpowers. Absolutely, Ahmad, your point about sanctions and all that, they're illegal. I mean, to put it plainly, unless they're sanctioned by everybody, agreed to by everybody, right? And many of these wars are also, quote unquote, to use, let's stretch the term a bit, illegal, because they have been taken out of the Security Council, which is the proper place where you're supposed to make decisions, and then taken out, and the decisions are made where pressure can be applied on countries. When you are a hegemon, right? You control the economic, you control my economic life. So why should I not support you? So you go and you have that, and then you have the wars in Afghanistan, you have the war in Korea, you have the wars elsewhere, and you have the war now well, that one is not started by the Western side, but you have that kind of situation. So I think we have to arrive at a better reimagination of what the international organization can do. Again, it's a very uphill task, but I think it is not impossible. So maybe I'll stop there.
Thank you, Prof. Now we are opening for questions. I may have to ask Encik Zahro to probably highlight the question from our participants. Encik Zahro,
sure.
please.
Yeah, sure, Dato'. Well, we have a number of questions here in the chat box. One is from the member of EPM. Yeah. Could USA averted this war if the USA has advised Ukraine not to join NATO at this point in time? So this is the first one. The second one is coming from Prof. Munira. I'm not sure whether this has been answered, but her question, ASEAN, okay, I think this has been answered, I guess. Okay, the other one coming from Prof. Kupran. Will this Ukraine war mean a further crippling of globalization, especially after the tendency to use wide-ranging economic sanctions against countries that may violate the world order? Right? Okay. From Prof. Munira, the third question. If we look at systemic factors that contribute to war, should we start to conceptualize a world without hegemons? Is this practical, feasible, achievable, and realistic given human nature? The fourth coming from Prof. Jayum. Yeah. How does the Ukraine war impact upon Southeast Asia, and for example, Malaysia, in economic terms? Right.
Okay.
And the last one, Prof. Yeah, this one coming from Wong Chui. How far has nuclear deterrence led to escalation of Russian-Ukraine crisis? Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Encik Zahro. I think we have 5 questions, and we will leave to the speaker and also discussing if they want to respond to those questions. Can we start with Prof. Johan first?
Yeah, sure.
And then to Akhtar and then Professor Fandi.
Yeah, I'll take the ones that I feel I should answer and maybe leave to both our very capable discussants to tackle some of the other ones. I think, could a war have been averted? I am on 2 minds on this. One is because, as I said, the Russian action did not start in February. War was already ongoing from 2014, and of course, you're going to push things back to the Russian influence of Ukrainian politics. Viktor Yanukovych and all that kind of. Then there was a guy called different individuals that came on the scene. Russia would have wanted. By Russia, some people say you can just substitute the word Putin. Would have wanted a compliant Ukrainian state. So you start with that position that Russia was interested in a Belarusian kind of arrangement. And because, for very important reasons, of course, and it already carried out the Black Sea right there. So strategically speaking, this was very important for Ukraine to be within the Russian sphere of influence, or the Russian orbit. This is geopolitics. And it would be very difficult for Russia to not have even recognized the Russian separatists. Remember MH17. MH17 was shot down by Russian separatists, right? Yeah. And there was a suggestion that Russia had been involved. But it's an ongoing thing. So it's like how long did it take the Irish what do you call it, IRA and that thing to be settled until the Good Friday agreements, right? Wasn't there? And so in this case, the Russian positioning vis-a-vis Ukraine is a very tough one to follow. But that said, it could have been averted if NATO had not pushed or allowed Zelensky to go as far as to say, I want to join NATO. NATO should have said, no, you remain neutral, you remain outside. You know, there are many other, for example, Sweden, and I believe they are implicated or they're part of the NATO friendly countries, but they're not in the military alliance. Something of that sort, would that have satisfied, again, it's counterfactual, right? Would that have satisfied Putin? So I think this war was on the cards. Yeah? It was coming. And I think a very good final solution to this would be the neutralization of Ukraine. You remember after the First World War, the Finlandization is called. Finland became a totally neutralized state because they were very important for Russia to remain outside of the Western Bloc. So something of that sort, maintaining national, system of national character, what you might, of the Ukrainian state. But again, some people argue that because of the Russian presence and internal politics, you might have a kind of a divided, but you can also have other more imaginative solutions, autonomous regions. We've done it in Southeast Asia, you know. We have autonomous regions for Aceh, and we have the autonomous region for Bangsamoro. So these are not within the human capacity, Dato Akhtar, to do. The human DNA has got all kinds of interesting capabilities if you push it to the limit, right? So that's the war can be averted question. Systemic factors, post-hegemony. I think I already spoke of post-hegemony. I think ideally, of course, the world in a post-hegemonic world order, you do not have the powers that are now invested economically and politically in the in the superpowers, but you can't turn back the clock. So I think we can create regions of post-hegemony. So you can create regions, and again, Southeast Asia is a good experiment. Can we create those regions where we avoid having the hegemony of superpowers? I think that's the main project as far as I'm concerned. Globalization is going to be affected, like it or not. But the world system currently is still a very neoliberal world order. People have to watch, states watch their own national interests, and supply chains have already been disrupted very greatly. But if you look at the economic numbers, I'm no economist. It's really a crazy world, right? Stock markets can be shooting up when the war is on. So it may not mean that globalization will actually suffer a blow. Maybe immediately there'll be some kind of check on it. But over the long run, it can actually revive itself if these supply chains and so on are restored. Yeah, that's kind of a broad answer to the question. I think the rest I will leave to you all. My capable discussants. Yeah, to answer the other questions.
Thank you. We have 5 minutes from Dato Akhtar and followed by Prof. Effendi. Silakan.
Thank you, sir. Could the war be avoided? Of course, and all wars can be avoided. If you look at this from the helicopter view, I come back to my point about the human DNA. There's actually two paradigms of thought. If you subscribe to this philosophy that men have been in war for more than 2,000 years, then war is inevitable. But if you do not subscribe to this ideology, And then you say there are geopolitical reasons, there are political reasons, there are economic reasons, and how to avert war, that aspirations of nation and neighboring states can reach a common ground. Then you go into this debate about who is right and who is wrong. Then you have Team A that will say that Russia acted in self-defense because NATO was coming to their doorstep. And then Team B will say Russia's act to invade Ukraine was a preemptive strike, unbecoming of the new human values that we have, killing the innocents. So the debate goes on and on and on until we get the next war. I mean, what happened to Afghanistan? The Russians came in there, destroyed the nation. The Taliban were the bad guys. And they couldn't hack it and they left. And then the Americans came in there. The Taliban were the bad guys, and then they couldn't hack it and then they left. And today the Taliban is ruling the country. I mean, you know, as we investigate and analyze the different wars, I personally cannot run away from this helicopter view on the humankind wanting to kill his own for the last 2,000 years, and it hasn't stopped. So it all depends to the person asking this question. My short answer is that it all depends on your perspective. That is why the conceptual solution that I provide for this perspective is that if you subscribe to the idea that war is inevitable, whether it's Ukraine or Africa or Afghanistan or Syria, then we as the human being, citizens of the world, we have to focus on the instrument to prevent war in our region. And we know the weaknesses of the global instrument in the United Nations, the P5. As Prof. Johan mentioned, it's a tedious task to actually change it. But we have regional mechanisms which we can use or explore its boundaries of to prevent war in Southeast Asia, which is what the topic is about anyway. Thank you. Back to you, Prof. Effendi.
Thank you. Excellent closure, Dato' Akhtar. And now I pass to Professor Effendi. You are muted.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. Dato' Ahmad, and Prof. Johan already answered it very well, and then fellow Utama Dato' Akhtar also give his very excellent opinion about Ukraine war. Yeah, and then my opinion, when war has started, then it's very difficult to stop. And then 2 weeks ago, Zelensky already declared that Ukraine will not joining NATO. Yeah, and then the war is still going on. And then the issues now is the role of NATO. Is NATO going to involve in the war to stop just like what NATO has involved in Bosnia War? And Bosnia War, NATO successfully stopped the war. But in this case, NATO is facing giant superpower, Russia. And then just like Prof. Johan said, if NATO involved, probably the war is going to be accessible, is going to be spent to the other European countries. So this is the issue of the how to stop, or probably it's going to be expand more to the other European countries. So I think I'm clueless about the war in Ukraine, how to stop it. It's not like NATO involved in Bosnia. It's small countries, and then the enemy also is quite small countries. But now NATO or European countries, Western bloc is facing superpower, yeah, nuclear power, and then I can see the how to solve the issues. Even the United Nations also, their role is very limited now. in the Security Council, Russia has a veto power. Yeah, and in General Assembly, just voting, you cannot give any impact to the war, to stop the war. So yeah, that's all. That's my position or my opinion on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Fandi. And I think we have to stop at 12:15 unless there are more questions, Encik Zahrul, or should we stop here now?
Well, there is one question here, Dato', from Dr. Dakil, I guess. Well, how this war going to affect Russia's situation in Syria? Yeah, and I think this is the last one. Yeah.
Okay, well, I leave it to the participants, to the panelists, Professor Johan or Dato' Akhtar or Prof. Effendi on this question. Would you like, who like to take the lead on this? Okay, Prof. Johan, yeah.
Yeah, I can try. Well, Russia in a way will be stretching its capabilities, but the paradox of it is that the Syrian situation has more or less been left fallow by the West. So the West is not that interested in the situation right now. I suspect Turkey, I haven't looked in the more recent kind of development. Turkey is still very concerned about that, the Syrian situation. But you know, it's a war that sort of, you know, it didn't end with it's not a war that ended, but it's a war that sort of subsided. And you will continue to have low intensity conflict there. The Russians, Putin basically he's got a very strong regime which is in collaboration with him, you know, Bashar's Syria. So I think we'll be happy to have that continue. So in a way, it's quite independent. It would not. My first, reaction would be, I think it doesn't really affect very much, but it could stretch the Russians in terms of their capability. If, for example, the Ukraine war becomes highly protracted, and there's more and more involvement by NATO directly or indirectly, even as we speak today, apparently the resistance is very strong, right? Depending on who you read, you know, the resistance is strong, but it's been going on longer than the Russians expected, I think. So that's that consideration in terms of the Syrian situation.
Thank you. I think that it will be the last question from our participants. Zahrul?
Yes, that's all. Yeah.
And now what remains to be done is to have a closing remark from Professor Johan, 3 minutes, and then I will also have a closing remark followed by Professor Johan remarks. Please,
thank you,
Johan.
Thank you, Prof. Ahmad. Yes, I think it's been a learning experience for me actually preparing for this webinar. But as I said, when it was suggested to me, I wanted to look at the implications of Southeast Asia, which is a region in which we are in. And I think it has a lot, as I sort of concluded, a lot of implications for Southeast Asia. I think the major lesson that we have to learn from the Ukraine war is that we remain autonomous and independent as far as possible of superpower intervention in the terrain of Southeast Asia.
Thank you. I think that is an excellent remark. And I think I will follow suit and saying that, I think as you said, the neutralization of Ukraine is most likely be the best solution here. And that the idea that how do we avoid hegemony, perhaps by creating more regions, and ASEAN should be an example of neutralism or neutrality in that sense, despite the fact that there are a lot of criticism leveled against ASEAN. But I think as a believer of ASEAN, I think we have done great for the past how many decades. We are able to manage conflicts within us. And I think that would be a best example. And if there is a Nobel Peace Prize, I think ASEAN should be one of those who should receive or become the beneficiary of that. And as Dr. Akhtar said, the war is inevitable. I think I agree with you that is why we have the UN Charter in anticipation of that, the Article 51, which allow for provision on defense. And I think as long as that is the situation, we therefore must give a chance to have that belief, or the belief that the UN system is currently the best system that we have. And at the regional level, I think ASEAN must play its vital role in ensuring that this region is free, there is a freedom, there's a neutrality, and I think we respect one another. So with that, I must thank you, Professor Johan, discussion, Professor Fandi and Dato' Akhtar. This has been a very enriching session with excellent input, of course, from, I don't know, I would like to call it the pundits of international relations. Three of them with their excellent record have given the best, I suppose, view as regard to the happening, the current happening in Ukraine. And of course, we hope that there is humanity at the end of the day. We pray all the very best to the Ukrainian, and the world will be at peace once again. So thank you, Academic Professor Malaysia, for inviting me. I must thank you for that, and thank you for the opportunity. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and salam sejahtera.
Waalaikumsalam.
Waalaikumsalam.
Alhamdulillah.
Thank you, Prof. Dato' Rahmat. Ladies and gentlemen, we have now come to the end of the ceremony. It is hoped that the lecture and discussion that will be benefit from all of us. On behalf of the Secretariat of APM, I would like to thank everyone for the support and cooperation given, without which this webinar could never be realized. And we have some message from APM for those who are interested to become a members of APM. Please fill in the form provided in the chat box. The form also can be obtained from the website of APM. Thank you. Let's make some photo group before we end the session. Please turn on your camera. All right. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay, one more, 1, 2, 3. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, Prof. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Dato'.
Yeah, thank you all.
Prof.
Congratulations. Good discussion. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.